Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's online event hosted by the Wollstonecraft Society and the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. My name is Alpa Shah, and I'm a professor of anthropology and convener of the Global Economies of Care research theme at the LSE International Inequalities Institute. I'm delighted to be chairing today's event, the second annual Wollstonecraft Society Lecture. Today's lecture is titled Evacuating Women Judges in Afghanistan, a Tale of International Feminist Solidarity. And in the spirit of Mary Wollstonecraft, our speakers today, Helena Kennedy QC and Fawzia Amini, will share the extraordinary stories behind the evacuation of Afghan women judges following the fall of Kabul. This exchange will examine the hopes for women's rights internationally, set the story we all watched on the news into the framework of international justice, and consider those who are left behind. Helena Kennedy is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have the least power within the system, championing civil liberties and promoting human rights. She's used many public platforms, including the House of Lords, to which she was elevated in 1997, to argue for social justice. She's also written and broadcast on a wide range of issues, from medical negligence to terrorism to the rights of women and children. Fawzia Amini worked as a senior judge in Afghanistan's Supreme Court, heading a court that specifically dealt with women's causes until the Taliban took control on August 15, 2021. Fawzia previously served as head of the legal department of the Ministry of Women's Affairs and worked closely with the Ministry of Justice, where she reviewed laws from a gender perspective and ensured that women's rights were protected. Today, Fawzia is one of the few women fighting for a new Afghanistan. But before we hear from Helena and Fawzia, I'm going to hand over to Rowlatt, Chair of the Wollstonecraft Society, with whom we are jointly hosting this event, to say a few words about the Society and the lectures initiated in the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. Rowlatt is a writer and public speaker and a programmer of events at the British Library. Her most recent book, In Search of Mary, retraced Wollstonecraft's 1795 treasure hunt over the Skagerrak Sea. Please note that we have a live captioneer and BSL interpreters at today's event. And to activate the captions, please just click on the CC button at the bottom of your screens. You can also access the larger captions by using the link that has been posted in your chat box. So if you would want to make use of the BSL interpreting, please pin the two interpreters to your screen. And you've got to basically hover over each of their videos, click the three dots and select pin. So the event is going to last for an hour and 15 minutes, from 6 o'clock to 7:15 we will finish. As usual, there'll be a chance for the audience to post questions in the final half an hour or so of the event. And you can do so by either using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens or stating your name and affiliation where possible. Those of you present today may also be interested in an online LSE public event tomorrow, 6:30 to 8 p.m. around the new issue of the LSE Public Policy Review, Lessons from Afghanistan, which is chaired by Baroness Kennedy and involving Dr. Michael Callon, Professor Michael Cox, Dr. Devika Hovel, and Nargis Nehan. This event will discuss, amongst other things, the US departure from Afghanistan, international law and development, and the consequences for women's rights. So yeah, it's great to be hosting the two events next to each other on Afghanistan and women's rights too today in this week. The next public event of the III is Power, Privilege and Parties, the Shaping of Modern Britain, and it's going to take place at 6:30 on Thursday, the 26th of May. The link to that event, along with more upcoming events, can be found on the chat. I'm now going to hand over to Bea to say a few words about the Wollstonecraft Society and the annual lecture before Helena and Fawzia take the floor.
Thank you, Alpa.
Over to you.
Thank you. I demand justice. These are the opening words to Mary Wollstonecraft's pioneering 1792 work of vindication of the rights of woman. And the injustice that Wollstonecraft faced was to be denied an education. She came from a background of inequality and of violence and abuse. She was a single mum and she struggled financially all her life. And yet she became a trailblazing human rights pioneer whose writing changed the world. My name's B. Rowlatt, and I'm from the Wollstonecraft Society. It's a human rights education charity taking Wollstonecraft's human rights legacy into young people's lives. This is our annual lecture, and you're going to love it because we've got extraordinary speakers sharing a conversation that's truly inspirational. I'd like very briefly to frame that conversation in the wider context of the work of Mary Wollstonecraft and the idea of justice. Justice is an abstract, grand-sounding concept, but you don't have to be educated or important or even a grown-up to need it, to want it, and to recognize it. Every human on this planet has this in common. We have all at some point in our lives said, that's not fair. If you're a parent, you probably hear this all the time. But what this reveals is an innate sense of an awareness of things not being right. And this is something that we can track from our own immediate selfish or childish needs outwards into a wider sense for society. I joke about our kids going, it's not fair, but there is a direct continuum from that moment in a young person's life to the life-changing work of distinguished lawmakers like Helena Kennedy and Fawzia Amini. They too began by saying, that's not fair, and they went on to do something about it. And this brings us back to Mary Wollstonecraft, the inspiration for this lecture series. She was this chippy outsider, a largely self-taught philosopher, writer and educator. Her first book in 1787 was Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. This is especially poignant in light of the events in Afghanistan that we will be hearing about shortly. This work was followed by her powerful, incandescent vindications, both key texts of the Enlightenment. By the time of her untimely death, she had returned to the subject of young people's education and how to unfurl their minds and their sense and understanding of justice. So education was her life's work. She knew that education isn't just a human right, it is human rights in action. It is human rights made real, made tangible. And this is the work of the Wollstonecraft Society. We've just launched a brand new series of Wollstonecraft inspired classroom materials for primary schools to encourage and inspire a new generation of young people who can say that's not fair and go on to do something about it. We also collaborated on the first comic book of Wollstonecraft's life that's been delivered to school libraries up and down the country. And the new school materials show that someone from a really challenging background can still make a difference. They're also designed to generate community action, even among very young people. That sense that you can make a difference is very easily extinguished if you're young and you don't think you have any power. So developing and nurturing that sense is the work of the Wollstonecraft Society. So please support what we do if you can. If there are any teachers in the audience or friends of teachers, please share the materials which are available on wollstonecraftsociety.org. That's all from me. Meanwhile, I'm incredibly honoured and moved to be able to step aside and make way for the one and only Helena Kennedy, to Fawzia Amini, and to your very distinguished chair, Professor Alpa Shah of the LSE's International Inequalities Institute, Alpa.
No, straight over to you, Baroness Kennedy and Fawzia Amini. We are so grateful to have all of you and to our continued collaboration with you, B. Rowlatt. Thank you. Over to you, Baroness Kennedy.
Thank you so much, Professor Shah. It's lovely to meet you, Alpa. And it's wonderful to be here basically giving the Wollstonecraft lecture, although we're not giving the lecture in a traditional way. I really am thrilled to be here with Fawzia Amini. Judge Amini is a really formidable woman. She is courageous. She has been a leader. She has been a great pioneer of women's rights in Afghanistan. And she has been through a really traumatic set of events, because I want you all to imagine the circumstances in which someone has to leave everything behind, flee from your homeland, leaving behind relatives and people you love, fleeing with your husband and children to a country that you don't know, and putting yourself in the hands of people that you don't know. And it was really a hard thing to do. And I pay tribute to Fawzia, because not only has she done that for herself and for her family and her children, but she continues now to work for democracy in Afghanistan, and is working for a better Afghanistan in the future here in exile in the United Kingdom. So I'm proud to call her my sister. I have come to know her and love her, and we've become very, very close friends. Let me just start by saying a little bit about law and about why it matters. And Bea, who's another great friend and someone I admire enormously because of the work that she's doing in the field of education, she's absolutely right when she says that, you know, a fundamental human right is the right to an education. It really was a liberation for me. It's what changed my life. And so if we can find ways of really giving the opportunity to girls and women who have been disadvantaged around the world in not having equal access to education, then of course that is one of the ways in which we change the world. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I've practiced at the bar for many, many decades. And I started as a young woman lawyer, really quite innocent of the ways in which women were doubly burdened by a legal system that really so often failed women. And I say that because it became clear to me, the more I thought about it, that law had not been created by women. Historically, in all of our societies, law has been the product of male power. It's, you know, it was men who ran governments, it was men who ran countries, and so it was men who made the rules by which those societies operated. And so, of course, it was made from a perspective which was male, and it's not going to be surprising if it doesn't deliver justice for women. And as a young lawyer going into the courts acting often for women, I could see the ways in which law had enormous gaps when it came to women, and gaps particularly where it came to an understanding of women's lives and the particular circumstances that women are confronted with, that women so often are the primary carers of children, that women so often earn very much less money than men, that women are disadvantaged in so many different ways within society, and that women have much less power in societies everywhere. As I have developed my own practice and traveled to other parts of the world, and now do quite a lot of my work in international law, I see the ways in which this is not just the experience of the United Kingdom. It's not just Britain that has man-made law. It's true the world over. And it is a reflection on power. And so women, of course, as we've gained a bit more of our status and rights, have demanded change. But I learned about human rights really from my clients, from representing people who had suffered. And through that, have come to understand law's failings. Now, how did I come to be involved at all with Afghanistan? Well, I have increasingly been a campaigning lawyer. I campaign for change, and I campaign for change not just in relation to women in the United Kingdom, but also in other parts of the world. I now am the director of an Institute of Human Rights for the International Bar Association. And back in 2000 and 2008, actually, after the Taliban had been ousted from power, which had happened. You'll remember after 9/11, there was the invasion of Afghanistan, and the Taliban were ousted from power. And in the years that followed, great change took place in Afghanistan. And whatever we think about that invasion, it certainly did make a difference to the lives of women, because a new constitution was created. And I've had the great good fortune of meeting in fact, the man who's a great lawyer, Mr. Rassouli, who was the drafter of that constitution. And he was a modernizing man and a man who believed in democracy. And he introduced into it the whole idea that there should be rights and equality for women. That was in 2008. And at that time, I was the chair of the institute at the International Bar Association. And we were invited to come into Afghanistan to help create a bar association, an independent bar association, to help professionalize the legal services and legal professionals. And we argued, as you would expect from a feminist lawyer like me, I argued very strongly that we had to ensure that the justice system had women in it too, that women sat as judges, that we had to make sure that there were cohorts of women going into the law schools, and that the doors of the law schools had to be opened to women, that women had to be in every part of the, if you like, the institutions of a democratic society, and they certainly had to be in the law. And so I started following what was happening in Afghanistan, and we were involved in certain training programs in Afghanistan. And one of the things that happened in 2009 was that the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women was introduced into domestic law in Afghanistan. And so that's one of the great things about international law, is that there can be these conventions and nations sign up to them. And sometimes they sign up to them without thinking through what the real implications are. And then they have to be sort of pushed by citizens inside the society, and with encouragement from friends and cohorts outside, to really kind of create change. And so the introduction of that a convention to eliminate violence against women was a really radical change in Afghanistan. And it led to the creation of domestic law, which was to prevent domestic violence, forced marriages, child marriages, trafficking of women, rape of women, and physical assaults on women, and so on, because women were still receiving, being beaten in the streets because they didn't have their faces covered, or because they were wearing clothes that certain fundamentalists didn't think was appropriate. And so courts were set up to deal with all of those crimes. It's also important to remember that crimes were also being dealt with, which were about, which affected, in fact, cities like our own cities here in the United Kingdom. Opium is created in Afghanistan from poppies, and so there were special narcotics courts created to deal with the trade in drugs, because it had funded the Taliban and was continuing to fund Taliban type organizations in Afghanistan, but also was leading to, of course, the presence of heroin in many cities around the world. There were also courts that were just trying to deal with terrorism, and there were women judges sitting in those courts too, dealing with the attacks that were made on the military who were present in the country, and some would say as an occupying force, and others would say as peacekeepers. But we could have that discussion another day. But what we wanted to talk about here was the fact that women were entering the legal system. And it's really vital that in societies that we have a judiciary and a legal system that has people from very many different backgrounds, because that way you're more likely to get justice, because the experience of from wider sources will inform how justice is delivered. And there was a time here in the United Kingdom where, when I started at the bar, the only people who tried cases were men of a particularly, of a very privileged class background. They were white, they were upper class, and they had very little idea, in my view, of how ordinary people lived, and very little understanding of how women lived. And often, therefore, law did not deliver justice, and particularly for women. And we're still having problems about that. We're still having problems with the delivery of justice for women against the predations of men, violence from men, sexual harassment, rape. The delivery of justice is still a serious problem in this country too. But what happened recently, and it was just a year ago, was that a decision was being made by Western nations, led by the United States of America, to actually pull out of Afghanistan. They had been in Afghanistan for 20 years, and they felt that the time had come, and there was a lot of public pressure to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. That would have been fine if all had been on a solid base in Afghanistan. But no country is made just in 20 years. It's a long, hard struggle. And many people were involved in trying to build a modern Afghanistan. And many of them were women who were brave and courageous, but who entered into roles in the public sphere. Last year, early in the year, 2 Supreme Court women judges were assassinated. They were in a car on their way to the court. They had to be transported to court because even though we didn't read about it very much in our press, women judges like Fawzia were getting threats all the time that they were on the court. There was a regular thing that they would receive notes to the court and threatening them their lives and threatening their families and so on. Because there were many men in the society who did not believe that women should be holding those kinds of roles. And here we were, 2 Supreme Court women on their way to the court in a car being driven, and suddenly the door was opened, and an assassin shot one of them through the head and the other one through the heart. It was a message to all women judges to say, you shouldn't be there. How dare you sit in judgment on men? How dare you be so presumptuous? This is not the role for women in our society. That was the message. And the message was to other women to put fear into them. And of course, it was the experience also of women who were members of parliament, women who were journalists, and many of the women who were brave enough to take part in those parts of life which so often we take for granted. But the courage that it took to take those roles was really incredible. Fawzia will tell you about her own work and her role in the courts and in the system. And as you heard, she was in the Justice Ministry before. She was somebody who really was putting together, if you like, the structures for delivering justice for women. And then she ended up being the head of the women's courts, because the special courts were created for women, because many of the women in Afghanistan were uncomfortable about going in front of men to tell them about the things that they experienced, often of a sexual nature, but even to speak to men about the violence that they experienced was something that they were fearful of. And so to go in front of a court where the judge was a woman, where the prosecutor was a woman, gave them confidence to speak about the terrible things that happened to them. The ways in which their children would be taken from them, the ways in which they would be accused of adultery without any evidence, and often beaten and battered for accusations. And so children would be taken away, and often when marriages ended and a man had gone off with somebody else, he would take his children, so the woman would be left without her own children with her. So those were the cases that were coming before the courts. And of course, the imprisonment of the men who committed these terrible crimes brought real rage against the women judges. When last year, the American troops left and the British troops left, and you'll remember you saw it on your news screens, people were desperate to get out of Afghanistan, people who were in fear for their lives. People who worked in the British embassies, the American embassies, people who were in the military there, people who had worked as translators and so on for the British military, for the American military, for the military of Germany and the other NATO countries that were present there. Many of those people were being transferred out of the country, but no one made any significant voice about helping the evacuation of those who would be at the highest risk. And I can tell you that those who were at the highest risk were, of course, the women who had been in the justice system or in parliament and who'd played roles which these men found unacceptable. In the week before the military left and the embassies all got out, the Taliban took over Kabul. They'd been taking over the provinces bit by bit, and then they took over Kabul. And once they had taken over Kabul, then threats became very real. The men were released from prison. The prisons were emptied. The doors were opened, and prisoners and criminals were released from prison. And many of them were men who had been convicted of violence and crimes against women and murders of women. And it was the women's courts that had dealt with those men, and those men came after the women who had sent them to prison. Fawzia, I will tell you about what happened, the threats and the fear that was inculcated in all those women. Well, I started receiving phone calls and text messages from women that I knew in the legal system in Afghanistan. A woman judge here had been after the murder of the two other Supreme Court judges, Fawzia, who was on the Supreme Court, the British Foreign Office had put her in touch with a judge here in Britain who became Fawzia's sort of a mentor, a sort of a friend, an external friend to whom she could speak from time to time. And that woman judge contacted me to tell me about Fawzia and the fact that she was in desperate danger, mortal danger, and was going to be killed. A kill list was created by the Taliban, and the women judges were on that kill list. And so we started to think about how we could try and get them out. And well, I'm going to try and cut this story short, but we will go back to it after you've heard from Fawzia. But I looked to see how it could be done. Fawzia was trying to get out even before the final day, the last day of August, when the military all evacuated in their planes. She was trying to get to the airport, and I contacted the Foreign Office here to see if we could do something about getting her onto one of those planes. And indeed, she did get a message from the Foreign Office, but you'll remember that bombs went off in the airport, and so she wasn't able to get to the airport with her family in time to get to any plane. Because the bombs went off and no one was being allowed to travel into the airport vicinity. So Fawzia went into hiding, and she'll tell you about it. But it was a shocking thing, because she and many other women judges were in the same situation. They were in terror for their lives. And I want you to know that since all of this has happened, many women have disappeared. We don't know where they are, where we fear for whether they are still alive. We know that people have gone into hiding, so it's very hard to document exactly the position of some of the women judges who remain there. In the end, I managed to evacuate 103 judges and their families, so over 500 people. It was only possible because I tried to find out how people were getting out. And some people were managing to sort of trickle over the border into Pakistan, into Uzbekistan, into other countries. And but only ones and twos, and only those who didn't have 4 children, as Fawzia had. And so it was possible for a single person to make that journey to the borders. And so I heard that some Christian, small communities of Christians in Afghanistan were being evacuated by Christian communities in the United States of America. And so I have a wonderful group of lawyers who work with me at the Institute of Human Rights that I direct for the International Bar Association. And we all went to work on this, of how can we see if we can get some of these women out. And we contacted those who were evacuating the Christian communities to see if there was any room at the back of their planes. And there wasn't, but they did give us the details of the charter companies that they were using and planning to use to get the Christian evacuees out. And so we got the details of those charter companies, and then I contacted them, and to the shock of my life, it was going to cost $750,000 for a not very large plane, a plane that would take about 150 people. And of course, we didn't have any money like that. And so we started the business where I started contacting people and begging and trying to raise the money. And I have to say that I was helped by the most incredible, generous people, and I'll tell you a bit about that later. But we ended up getting 3 planes together. One of them went out at the end of September, a month after the big military evacuation. We took a plane out, and Fawzia was on that plane with her husband and her 4 girls. And it was a plane where we had 26 judges and their families. And we'd had to find somewhere where they could land. And I'm afraid that the UK was not offering that option. But we knew that the president of Greece was a woman who'd been a judge. And through a contact, we got through to her, and she made intercession for us with the Prime Minister of Greece, and he agreed to this first plane coming. And that was how Fawzia ended up traveling. We took that plane. We intended flying over Iran, but Iran refused to let us go through their airspace. I became like a travel agent who had to understand about flight paths and so on. We ended up taking, no European country was letting a plane from Afghanistan arrive. Land. So we went to, we took the group of women and their families to Tbilisi in Georgia, one of the former Soviet countries, but an independent country now. They let us land there. We changed planes, and we took we then had a plane which transferred the families to Greece, to Athens, and Fawzia was on that first plane. And then I went round and we managed to get some more money. And I want you all to know that it was about the solidarity of women, because it was so often women who came forward with money, or who spoke to their menfolk and said, we have to help these women. Great philanthropists from Canada, a husband and wife, the wife was wonderful. J.K. Rowling gave me a huge sum of money to help find accommodation in Athens for the escaping judges and lawyers. Anyway, I can only say to you that so much of this became possible because of the solidarity of women around the world who really wanted to help these women who were so courageous and who were trying to build safe havens for women within the law in Afghanistan. Now I'm going to take it over to you, Fawzia, so that you can tell your side of the story and about your career in the law in Afghanistan, about your family, and about that terrible, terrible time when you had to go into hiding, when you were in a safe accommodation that we found for you, and then the transfer through the night to the airport up in the north of Afghanistan, and that frightening business of getting the plane to escape.
Yeah.
Fawzia.
Thank you, Ms. Baroness. Thank you so much. Hello to all the friends and professionals present, especially Miss Baroness Helena Kennedy, Miss Alpa, and Mrs. B. Rowlatt, and my all of friends. Thank you so much. I am Judge Fawzia Amini, the head of Appeal Court of Violence Against Women in Kabul province. I would like to begin by thanking to organizations, especially also the government of the and UK Abuja. They work day and night to save as judges, women's rights activists, lawyers, and truly great people of our country. We were brought to this beautiful and safe country, and we were called for from death and suffering. It's truly unforgettable for us. And I investigate hundreds of cases of violence against women. And in issued and decision, I have proposed for the Violence Against Women Act, the Family Act, the Child Custody Act, and the Shelter Regulation. I have worked on all the convention to which Afghanistan is committed, both in the Ministry of Women Affairs and during my tenure in the Supreme Court of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I have reviewed the cases of judges who have committed violence. I have been the supreme representative of the Supreme Court in the Supreme Council of Women of my country, and I have done the most for judges and women. I have put the history of my coming to the previous meeting, and I want to tell you today about the pain and problems of the women and the children of our country that have happened recently today. Today, everyone knows that Afghanistan has become a secretary being do not matter there. The Taliban do not allow women, especially educated, to work at all. They are not allowed to travel. Girls' school have been closed again, and the hopes of all young girls, they do not have the hope of a progress. They suffer. Right. They are also educated, but today they have no duty and have been fired from their job, especially female. They have often been forced to leave their homes, have been into relatives' house. They have no clothes or food to eat. Their bank accounts have been illegal house-to-house raids are ongoing. Women are killed in different ways. My friends say that in different of the we say behind it or we do not they are. And other jobs completely gone. Especially in the process, our judges are all in a state of panic. We had our clothes. We are so stingy that we could not recognize each other, and we only thought about saving our lives to see if I or my daughter will survive or not. We have looked at everything. I want to have many thanks. The IB transferred has really well from provinces to Greece, and after a temporary there we were transferred here. The transfer process was very difficult, but the result very excellent and family safe years, and we thanking and appreciating friends, especially Ms. Baroness Helena Kennedy, to help us very much. Thank you so much, Ms. Baroness. Thank you.
Fawzia, I do hope people could hear you, because sometimes you cut out a little, and sometimes the sound was quite slow, but quite low. But I'm sure that people heard, because the wonderful interpreter has given us the opportunity of having what you said come up in print on the bottom of the screen. I want everyone to know that Fawzia and her family their home was likely to be attacked, and they knew that. And so one of the things that we had to do was to find a way of finding a safe house. And we can't talk about how that was done. But basically it was about finding a place in which we could take many of those judges and provide them with some security. And we were helped on the ground by people that we can't name, who provided some security. One of the things was that we couldn't leave from Kabul airport, because it was just not operating as an airport, and air traffic control were not working there. But the place that we left from was up in the very northern part of Afghanistan, and in a different province. And it was a journey of 8 hours. It was like, going from here up to Edinburgh or somewhere. And so it was a long journey with many road blocks at different places, which the Taliban were manning. And we were very anxious about people being seen and found. Sometimes the women had to wear burqas and cover themselves in case they would be identified. And we had to make sure that they didn't travel. We were given advice that it was best not to travel in convoy, so as that would be likely to alert people to the fact that there was some kind of evacuation taking place. And so we had to split the women up and then find accommodation up in Mazar al-Sharif, which was the place where the northern airport was. And we got there, and the women were there for a couple of nights. The terrible thing that I had to make a decision about was that not everybody in Afghanistan has a passport, and in fact not many at all. And so in the first instance we decided that we would, for the first flight, because we didn't know just how tight the rules would be at the airport, was to put people on the first flight who did have passports. And fortunately, Fawzia had a passport suited to her husband, and we got Fawzia and her family onto the flight with the passports. That flight was such a painful experience for me, because I was full of anxiety and stress about what would happen and whether we would get the flight to be able to even leave, or whether it might be blocked by the Taliban. And I do think that at that time, the Taliban were still wanting to try to show to the West that they weren't preventing people who wanted to leave from leaving. And it was difficult to know. We just couldn't be sure. And the person who was running the Mazar al-Sharif airport was not a Taliban person himself, but was very much fearful of the Taliban. And so he was going by the rules very strictly. And on the morning that the flight was due to leave at about 6, I didn't sleep at all that night well. I was tossing and turning all night. And then in the morning, At 6 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call, and I don't know what time it was there, but the flight, I was told that the husband of one of my women, his passport was not up to date, and that they were not going to let him through. And I had a conversation with the woman judge to say, look, why don't you get on the plane and take your children? And I promise you, I'll do all my very best to try and get your husband to join you. Reunification of families, uniting families is part of the UN policy around refugees. And our country should adhere to that. But of course, it's, it's not straightforward. And the woman then said to me, please guarantee me that you have to give me a guarantee that you'll get my husband out. And I couldn't give her that guarantee because I know what our immigration system's like. And I know from my colleagues who do immigration work how hard sometimes it is to reunify families. And so I said, I can't guarantee you, but I promise you I'll do everything I can. And she started to cry and said, if you can't guarantee me, and I had to stand her down. She and her children and her husband. And it was heartbreaking. And she wept. And so then did the other women around her began crying because their friend couldn't come on the flight and wasn't able to escape with them. And I had to say that when I put the receiver down, I cried too. Anyway, so the flight went without her and her husband. I am happy to say that at a later stage, we got her them all on a later flight because we managed to persuade the airport to allow people to get on the flight with identity cards, because by that time it was impossible to renew passports or acquire passports or anything of that sort. And so for the later two flights that we did a month later, it was possible to get people on who just using their identity cards. But in the meantime, I'd had to fly out to Athens to see the immigration minister because Greece had not wanted to take any more flights. They already have a refugee problem of their own. They took in so many people, landed on their shores from Syria, and they're in the islands like Lesbos and so on, where the camps are. And so they were not keen to have more people coming. And I flew out and saw the immigration minister and persuaded him to let some more flights arrive, so long as I raised the money to pay for hostels and food and so on, and the needs of the families, and he agreed to that. But it put, of course, an incredible burden on us trying to raise money. And let me tell you the big disappointment for me. The big disappointment for me was that I thought the world would open its arms to these brilliant, amazing, courageous women, and it didn't. And countries did let us down. Our own country has only taken a very small number, 9. Fawzia, how many Afghani judges are in Britain now?
We are 13 judges, Miss Baroness, 13 judges.
13.
Yeah, 13.
And that took us some time. I had to phone up. I phoned up all my friends around the world. I phoned up Mary McAleese, who was the president of Ireland, who was a lawyer and who I studied at the same sort of time as me, but in a different university. And I said to her, Mary, you have to help me. And she got Ireland to take in 20 families. I phoned up my friend Sandy Toksvig, who's appears on television and so on. She had once introduced me to a friend of hers who was the Prime Minister of Iceland. And we got through to her, and and Iceland's a tiny wee place, very small population. They took in a couple of families. I mean, a couple of families can mean 12 people, but they took in. I was hammering the phones, and it was women around the world that I contacted. Women in Australia, we got Australia to take in 20. And then through a saga that is too long, Canada came in and really took the lion's share of the women, and it was wonderful. I was helped paying for these flights was a real problem, and because it meant that I had to, you know, if it was £750,000 per flight, you can tell that I did 3 flights, so that meant that we had to and for the safe houses and security and so on, and then paying the food and so on. I think we raised something like 3 million. Had to raise £3 million, and it was a long, hard old slog doing it, but we owe it to our sisters who are facing these terrible events, and it saddens my heart that there are still women in Afghanistan, women who are in hiding. And I receive text messages from them, and not just women, of course, men too. And of course, I do want to say something about the men, because we know about the bad guys, but there are also wonderful men. I mean, Fawzia's husband is a really wonderful man, and many of these women. I mean, these are women who were married to the kind of men who were happy for them to be being judges and lawyers and MPs and so on. So, and they were all themselves often lawyers and judges too. Fawzia's husband was a very wonderful prosecutor who took these hard cases as well. And so, you know, with all these women, there were also very fine, good men came out with them because they wanted to protect their womenfolk. And but of course now Afghanistan is no longer in the news, and we're not hearing about the horrors that are taking place, and about the starvation and the poverty and the fact that there's no food, and that people who are in hiding can't access food. It's a terrible, terrible indictment of the international community that we have failed so badly. And then, of course, we're now dealing with the horrors of Ukraine and the fleeing women and children there. So our world is going through a really dark time. And I regret to say that I think it will continue to be dark for some time, because we've got so many populist authoritarian governments who look for people to blame, and so they blame foreigners and they blame immigrants and they blame anybody who's different for the ills, usually which have been caused by the greed and the kind of self-enrichment of those who are powerful. And of course, we're also facing climate change. So we will see the displacement and movement of people in increasing numbers into the future. And it's a moment where we're going to have to think about how we redesign our world. The United Nations does not seem to be working very well, because you've got 5 nations in the Security Council who can blight positive things being done, where, you know, war crimes have been committed in Ukraine, and it's impossible. I'm now working around the war crimes that are happening in Ukraine, and Russia will exercise its veto, and so it will be impossible to get them before the International Court of Justice. And so we really, what we need are new structures. What we need is a greater sharing of the world's resources, and we're not doing that. And so what we've been describing, and Fawzia's experience, is a tragedy that a democracy that was developing has been cut off in its prime. And it's people like Fawzia who are still trying to give hope and faith to people that it will change, that it will not always be so. But we're living in a dark moment, and it's going to mean that all the good people of our world have to come together and be heard and call for justice. We have to have justice, and a real kind of justice. So it may be a good moment for us to think about having some questions, Alpa.
I mean, that was just so moving and so extraordinary, and I really, really thank both of you, from the bottom of my heart, for sharing this amazing story. And yes, you are so right, Baroness Kennedy, it is a dark, dark time, and it's only getting darker and darker. But you have given us so much hope in the kind of solidarity you have generated through this particular story of the relationship between you and Fawzia, which is telling a much bigger story of the possibilities for international solidarity and also solidarity between women. And it is just, you know, wonderful, wonderful to have you here. And we're so privileged to be speaking with you right now. And I invite questions from the floor. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will call them up. But I really want to thank both of you, Baroness Kennedy and Fawzia Amini, for being here with us today and sharing this story. Yeah.
But I do want you to know that I've learned so much from Fawzia, because Fawzia and the other judges, you know, spending time with them and seeing, it's hard for people to understand what exile is like, that to flee and to be in a new place. And Fawzia expresses her gratitude and so on to Britain for you know, opening its doors to her and to her family. But you know, she still doesn't have a proper home. She's still living in a hotel in Earl's Court. Yes, her girls are going to school, which is so wonderful, and they're the most wonderful young women. They're aged between sort of 17 and I think 12, I think the youngest one might be, or 10. And they're really lovely girls who will make a huge contribution to this country. But it's so hard for Fawzia, who would like to have the opportunity of perhaps retraining, and yet has had to leave everything behind. And her bank accounts and her savings were frozen and by the Taliban. And so she has come with nothing. And, you know, and she has faced this hardship with such courage and such strength of character, such strength of will.
Thank you, Ms. Baroness. Thank you. We lose our hope now, because our country not have anything. Everyone lose their rights, their fundamental rights, especially the women, the children. They not have education now. They not have food. They not have jobs. I'm very worried about our people or our country now. But so I'm very happy now.
You've just muted yourself, Fawzia.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes. And also I'm very happy and I'm very lucky to be here and save my children in me. But I'm very worried our women, especially the women judges, to remain in our country. No jobs, no food, no clothes, no places to live, people. It's very difficult for us, for our people. Our situation running very bad today. I'm very lucky to stay here now.
Well, we're lucky.
Very lucky.
We're lucky to have you here with us, Fawzia, because
thank you, Baroness.
I know the contribution you will make. But you know, Alpa, every so often my phone will ping, and I'll see that a message has come through to me, and it will be a plea for help. And I've now learned how to do this, you know, to charter a plane. I know that there will be people who would help to do that, but I couldn't go through the thing again of trying to get countries to take people when it was so hard this first time round. And we managed to evacuate 103 judges. That meant over 500 people altogether, because these are women who have families. They were young women, you know. Fawzia is not an old woman. She's not, you know, our Supreme Court judges are usually women who are in their 60s at least. Well, you know, Fawzia is nothing like that. And the women who were judges would be often in their 30s because it was a professional judiciary. You could qualify as in law and then go do the additional training and become a judge when you were in your late 20s. And then there were the prosecutors and so on. They were all young and had children and young children. And we had delivered several babies in Athens because women got out while they were pregnant. And so you will all enrich our country. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But I would like to be able to help some of the women who are still there, desperate to flee. But it would have to be that Britain said that they would take another 20 judges and their families, and that they would let a flight land at Stansted and give visas to those women before they came. And unfortunately, there's no system for doing that. Whatever they tell us, there's no system for Afghanis to get visas in advance.
I have a few questions that have come in, which I would like to pose to you. But I guess before we do that, I had a question of my own, and which was, we have this like extreme case of what's happened in Afghanistan. But as you said, Baroness Kennedy, we're seeing the rise of these authoritarian regimes, all over the world. And I work on India, and I'm working very closely with human rights lawyers who have been put in prison. These are the people who have been working, devoted all of their lives, sacrificed everything to work for nothing, for previously untouchable communities, for labor rights, for indigenous communities. And of course, there's a reason they're being targeted, so I'm constantly faced with this question of what can we do in relation to international solidarity for all of those people like Fawzia and other people in India and other places, Turkey, I'm thinking, who are on the front lines, of law, trying to fight all the difficult cases, keeping open the spaces of democracy in their countries. Like what mechanisms can we have right now? What can we do internationally? And obviously you've given a lot of thought to these issues, and you cannot chart the next flight. You can't do this all over again, as you said. What can we put in place? It would be great to hear something from you about that. But there are a few other questions as well. Yeah.
Alpa, one of the things I feel that we should be campaigning for in this country is to do what Canada has done. Canada does have special visas, emergency visas for human rights activists who are at risk. And we should have emergency visas for human rights activists who are at risk. And I would consider women judges who are dealing with courts where they're dealing with violence against women and so on in a situation such as Fawzia was, and the situation that Fawzia and her colleagues were in, they were human rights activists at risk. But they're often, for example, in India, I was contacted by the woman journalist who is a Muslim woman journalist who's speaking out about what Rana has.
Yes.
And we should have emergency human rights visas for human rights activists, for journalists, for the lawyers, for the people who run NGOs and who speak out, who suddenly have a price on their head. And we ought to be able to say, we have a human rights, get them on a plane and they'll be admitted into Britain. But we don't have that. And yes, of course, there's powers in the Home Secretary to let somebody in. I raised this recently with a minister, and they said, but there is a power vested in the Home Secretary to admit people. But I'd like something a bit more guaranteeing than the goodwill of Priti Patel, I'm afraid.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's brilliant. And in fact, the several questions along the same lines. So excuse me, but we will have addressed some of those. But let me turn to a question for Fawzia Amini. Could you give us some details, asks Jana Gurf, about some of the work that you were doing in Afghani courts. What sorts of cases did you take up? What were the outcomes and how did the system work? She asks. And I guess it would be great also to hear from you about what you think you can do now from here in relation to the colleagues and friends you left behind, and who are also doing or trying to do, continuing to do good work on the ground. Yeah, Fawzia, maybe if you just take whatever you'd like off that to answer.
Yes, please. I had my work in our courts, especially the cases I worked, the mother cases, marriage, forced marriage, or maybe another violence who have had there very much. But now I had a good relationship with my another colleagues who remained in Afghanistan, and also some families or judges in Greece. I have always answer their question, and always we should talk about the travel, or maybe our works, our experience. Sometimes, and I'm also worried about all of our women judges on our peoples, because they are remind there, they are have very more duties there. It's important. They are don't have fundamental rights because they cannot work in outside for the women, for the children. It's so hard and so difficult for our women judges or their families. Problems. It's very big to hear problems about the children. It's very difficult.
I think maybe Fawzia's connectivity has frozen. You have to understand that Fawzia's in a hotel in Earl's Court, which is not, I'm afraid it's not very well equipped, and the Wi-Fi is pretty questionable at times. So I'm afraid it looks as if she's
frozen, isn't she? Yeah. Well, if she comes back on, we can turn back to her. But so there's a question from Lisa Gormley, who's a visiting fellow at the LSE Centre for Women, Peace and Security here at the and she's saying she's really very, very moved and inspired for a call for a new system to protect human rights and justice, and she's asking about what other actions, as well as special visas for lawyers, judges and journalists, what else needs to happen for change on a bigger scale.
There are so many of these areas where I want to see change. I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize is that the levels of violence against women are not decreasing. I know that Steven Pinker, the great Harvard professor, insists that the world is becoming a less violent place, and it may be true in some regards, but I don't know that it's that true for women. Sexual violence in conflict is one of the areas that I now work on, and a task force has been created in relation to Ukraine, because there's testimonies coming forward of rapes of women by Russian soldiers on the ground. I mean, horrible testimonies, and I've done work on this in different places, and places where there's been genocide, where the suffering of women has often in the histories of war and conflict not been properly told, and the ways in which when you're trying to punish a people, that women are often the vector for doing that, by disgracing, humiliating, violating, and possibly even impregnating the women folk of a people, and we. Having that is now sort of, if you like, on the agenda. But of course, we have to be protective of making sure that the women in securing their evidence, that we don't over and over again re-traumatize them about what they've experienced. And so I feel that we've got to be calling for better ways of conducting investigations into the experiences of women in conflict. There are other things that I feel that we ought to be doing. Women have to be at the tables of peace and at the tables where we're discussing how we reach an end to some of these things. And I do think that the UN has run out of steam. It was created at the end of the Second World War, where people wanted change. And it seems to me almost as if there has to be a very dark moment before the will to make change is possible. I'm fearful that if we call for a new United Nations to be created, a new, because it started off with the League of Nations after the First World War, then there was the United Nations after the Second World War. If we were to call for some kind of reconstruction at this moment, unfortunately, the world is full of so many authoritarians. We might see our rights being reduced rather than improved. And so I have anxieties about calling for substantial change at this moment. But so I think that we have to keep on keeping on. And it may be that to do certain things outside of the remit of the UN. I mean, I think that we should be calling for more often for tribunals that are not inside the frameworks that have already been created, but for new frameworks and tribunals to deal with particularly the experiences of women and the violence that women experience. I also want to see, and I say this clearly, I want to look at the business of universal jurisdiction. I want to see it expanded. I did a case recently where a woman had been raped by a very powerful man in a government, in a particular government, and it was not possible to have him prosecuted in the United Kingdom for the sexual violation that he perpetrated, and his own country wouldn't do it because they're too afraid of him. So the idea that justice could be secured became, it was just impossible. And I think that there should be, for murder and rape, there should be universal jurisdiction where it's possible to prosecute somebody somewhere else, if that person is a person who holds office and is a person of great power. And I think we as women should be calling for better ways of securing justice on many different fronts. So that's what I'm doing I'm in my final chapters, if you like, as a lawyer, because my many years of doing it, and I want change now. I feel that just scraping at the edges is not good enough. It has to be fundamental. And I just recently did a report on misogyny for the Scottish Government, and it really is calling for quite radical change and law that is law for women. Recognizing that women can be targeted for certain kinds of crime and that we have to do something about it.
Thank you. And maybe I will give the last word to Fawzia Amini. There are a lot of questions, I'm sorry, we have not been able to ask because of the short time we have for Q&A. But Fawzia Amini, what about your hopes for change, and what would you like to see immediately, happen, and what from your experiences, what do you recommend in relation to the international community right now?
My wishes about my country and about our professional lives. We want to have begun our democracy or our fundamental rights, especially for the women rights. I think it's very wishes for our lives, for our country. Because our people lose everything now, and we hope that we have at the future all of our rights begun. Thank you.
Alpa, can I just say as a coda, a sort of postscript to what Fawzia's just said? Of course, we have to be calling for the rights of women in Afghanistan. and we have to be calling for women to have access to education. It goes all the way back to Mary Wollstonecraft and to Bee's introduction, where she spoke about how the thing that really was the engine that Mary Wollstonecraft identified for change, for women to become equal people, was that they had to be educated. And we really have to be saying that the Taliban's idea that somehow girls and women should not receive an education is so wrong. And even if we could secure that from them, if we could extract that from them, then the women themselves who are educated will then be insisting upon opportunities beyond staying in the domestic environment. They will want to play their part in the creation of a better society.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and for bringing us back to Mary Wollstonecraft at the end. And I thank both of you, Baroness Kennedy. Thank you, Fawzia Amini, and the wonderful B. Rowlatt and the Wollstonecraft Society for hosting this lecture. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the audience for coming today. All the best.
Alpa, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.